Hey guys, Todd Meehan here with Liquidrum in the Baylor University School of Music, and I am thrilled to be talking to you on this video for Black Swamp Percussion Sound Solution Project. So what I'd love to talk to you guys about is actually snare drum Fulcrum. Now, before you turn the video off, I know what you're thinking. Wow, the last time he did a Black Swamp video, he talked about setup for tambourine and triangle. He chooses really dull topics. It's true, I do, and I love them. But I love them because they're really, really important. If the setup is good, if our technique is sound, you're going to have a lot easier time actually doing your playing. So, bear with me. Let's start by defining what fulcrum is. Your fulcrum is your pivot point. Pivot point. That's it, pivot point. That's what fulcrum means. Now we need to determine where on the stick to put it and how we can manipulate it to help us play better. So, quick and easy exercise here to determine proper fulcrum placement. First thing I want you to do is just hold the stick between the thumb and the first finger in any old way. We'll get into the weeds in just a second here. But for the sake of this exercise, thumb and first finger in direct opposition, and I want you to hold it down at the very base of the stick. All we're going to do is we're going to drop the stick and let it naturally rebound. What you'll notice immediately is because we have so much weight in front of the pivot point and not a lot of weight at all behind the pivot point, we don't actually get much rebound from the stick naturally. What if we scoot that point up? Let's see what happens. That's interesting. So now we're getting some more interaction with the head. We're getting more natural rebounds. Why don't we scoot it up again? Oh, now things are getting quite interesting. So we're decreasing the amount of weight in front of the pivot point, the fulcrum, and we're increasing the amount of counterweight behind the pivot point. Shall we keep going? Okay, that's curious because now we get a huge initial bounce, but it takes a long time for the stick to come back down naturally. Maybe we've gone too far. Let's go one step further just to check and see what happens. Okay, so now we've shifted the pivot point so far that we have more counterweight than we have weight in the front of the fulcrum. All right, so all we're trying to find here is the spot on the stick that yields the greatest number of natural bounces. Now, on most sticks, that's going to be about 1/3 of the way up from the butt, but you have to go through this exercise in order to find that very specific point on your snare drum sticks. Okay, so how do we hold it at that point? Well, I'm an open grip player, and what that means is I'm using the flat of the thumb in direct opposition with the first knuckle crease of the index finger. That becomes my fulcrum, that becomes my pivot point. What that does is it allows a little bit of space in between the thumb and the first finger, where the first finger meets the hand. Okay? It's also nice and open in the hand underneath. Okay, so is that it? We get the thumb and the first finger set, and then we're off to the races? Not so fast. Not so fast. I wish it were that easy. So if we're throwing the stick down and letting it naturally rebound up, and if we're doing that either from the wrist or from the arm, but only getting one interaction with the head with each stroke, here's the crazy thing that's happening. Our fulcrum, what we've defined as our pivot point, is actually more or less moving with the stick. It's following the stick. So this thing that we've just defined as the fulcrum, as the pivot point, isn't functioning as your pivot point at all. Uh-oh. Your pivot point is actually back here at the wrist, if we're throwing from the wrist, or further back if we're throwing from the arm or the elbow. So what are we getting at here? Well, this pivot point on the stick itself becomes crucial when we're talking about multiple rebounds on the head, i.e. rolling, whether we're talking about open rolls or closed rolls. And here's what happens when we do that. We throw the stick down, and for a split second we immobilize this pivot point, this fulcrum, on the stick, meaning we leave it down close to the head. And by doing that, the stick naturally, of course, will want to bounce back up from the head. So we have to find some way to make it repeatedly bounce and interact against the head before we pick that hand up and do the same thing with the other hand. Well, we only have two ways to do that, right? If we're throwing the stick down and immobilizing this fulcrum or pivot point on the stick itself, either we have to somehow put downward pressure in front of the pivot point, or, you see where I'm going, upward pressure from underneath. Well, reality, we only have one choice because we can't put downward pressure in front of the pivot point. You need your other hand or maybe a friend to do that. So all we can do is put upward pressure or resistance behind the pivot point. Here's the good news, friends. You've got other fingers behind the pivot point and they can help out. Okay, so here we go. We have our fulcrum defined between thumb and first finger. We throw the stick down. It wants to bounce back up. That's all it wants in life. But we want to keep it down against the head for maybe a rebound or two or three. So what we do is we apply a little bit of resistance from the middle finger just behind the pivot point. And all of a sudden, we get this magic moment. Of yielding more and more rebounds based on how much resistance we apply from the middle finger behind the fulcrum, behind the pivot point, and how long we leave the hand down on the drum, meaning how long we immobilize this actual fulcrum pivot point on the stick. Okay, so this is kind of crazy because normally, when we do these multiple rebound strokes, we're throwing from the arm, right? Well, the arm is still functioning as a pivot point. So the way I see that is we have macro pivot point coming from back here. Even if you do the chicken wing approach, right? Your fulcrum is actually somewhere here on the forearm. So you have a larger pivot point, and you have a micro pivot point or micro fulcrum on the stick itself. And I'm able to achieve any number of bounces without much effort because all I'm doing is using a little bit of middle finger resistance directly behind the fulcrum. So the functionality of how to get rebounds out of a single stroke doesn't really change from type to type, meaning from open roll to closed roll, the multiple varieties of closed roll. The only thing that I'm changing is the amount of resistance from the middle finger and how long I'm leaving the stick down. So if we do this with both hands, open stroke roll, we can change that to triple bounce. So that's just a little bit more resistance from that middle finger. We can go to maybe a pure buzz, which will be hard to hear on the pad, but and everywhere in between. So I'll go through a sequence where I'll start with a little more open style roll and morph into something that is closed and even more closed and then back. And all along the way, all I'm changing is this resistance. Because my skeleton rhythm of that roll stayed more or less the same, the amount of time I'm staying on the head isn't different based on whether I'm doing an open roll or a type of closed roll. The only thing I'm changing is that resistance behind the pivot point. Spend some time working with this. Spend some time doing this exercise with various sticks in your stick arsenal. Find that exact perfect placement of the pivot point or fulcrum on each individual stick, and know how to shift things around in order to achieve different results. Basically, what we're defining here is the place that will allow the greatest ease of rolling. That doesn't mean that's always the place that you end up putting your fulcrum or your control point on the stick. Sometimes if we're not playing a lot of reboundy or roll type material, we might move that fulcrum around to achieve other things. We might scoot it up to get a little bit more control, perhaps in soft playing. Or we might move way back on the stick to play with a lot of weight. So explore, experiment, but know how this functions so that you can utilize it to best serve your playing. Thanks so much, and I'll see you around.